So just for those who are dialing in for the first time today, this is actually part of a whole series of the so-called Liberal Communicators Network. It is the third cohort, which just graduated last month. Down there, very little, you see the little schedule that they went through. It was 2 months of a lecture series and capacity building on everything related to non-profit communication and non-profit marketing. And that's something where we wanted to bring in Rory to kind of conclude the series, because we did a lot of fairly standard stuff, the very basics, on a high level, of course, but the basics. And Rory is not famous for the basics, I would say. He's, I would say, a self-proclaimed maverick, and somebody who brings always a different angle to things. So in case you are not familiar with Rory, I mean, you should be. Rory is for the third time with us. He has helped all the other cohorts to graduate, and is one of our most well-beliked speaker that we have in our cohorts, in our program. And we are very blessed that he's joining us, because he's a very busy man, vice chairman of Ogilvy, so the famous marketing company. He's a TED speaker, so you can click on YouTube and see many of his TED Talks. He's a regular podcast guest. I don't know how many he does. It's hard to keep track, actually. And of course, he wrote the best-selling book, Alchemy, the surprising power, I think, right? The surprising power of ideas that don't make sense. And that's how I initially got acquainted with Rory. Once the book came out, I thought that's an interesting book. And before we dive into what you want to share today, Rory, with us, maybe you can help me with one thing, because you are famous in our circles for the Red Bull and Coca-Cola thing. So Red Bull is a surprising item to a certain degree that became successful. Yes. And I think it can tell us a lot about marketing, but it better comes out of your mouth than out of my mouth. So maybe you remind us of why you think Red Bull is such a remarkable story.
So what I think is so interesting, and I think this applies to quite a few significant innovations, in that I think, just to be fair, I think there are new innovative products that do make sense. But what is surprising about some of the most successful ones is that if you were a totally reasonable person, you could have killed off a surprisingly high number of innovations very early on, simply by using logic. So Dyson, there was no evidence that there was a market for a €500 or €700 vacuum cleaner, and certainly not for a €400 hairdryer before it existed. If you'd asked for pre-existing data to justify your hypothesis, there wasn't any. And Red Bull is probably the most extreme example, because if you sat down as a bunch of rational people and said, we need to produce a drink that competes with Coca-Cola, and Coca-Cola, apart from water, has enjoyed a dominant position as, the single biggest cold non-alcoholic drink, I guess, in the world, apart from water, for 70, 80 years. What do you do to compete? Well, logical people would say you need it to taste nicer than Coke, you need it to cost less than Coke, and it should come in a really big container so that people feel they get great value for money and a lot of hydration and refreshment. And yet the biggest attempt to compete with Coke is, as I said, is Red Bull. It comes in a tiny can, it costs a fortune, and it tastes disgusting. And when I say it tastes disgusting, when they researched it, almost everybody said, I wouldn't drink this piss if you paid me to. But, and this is where you come into context, if you change the context, okay, so you say this isn't entirely a drink, it's a medicine, and you have the additional benefit, and the fourth disaster for a soft drink is that you can't be sold to people under 60. Now, if you say this is a medicine, it's a drug, all those things which are weaknesses in a drink almost become a strength in a drug. You want drugs to be expensive, you want there to be a restricted dose, a small can, because it suggests the contents are potent, and we expect drugs to taste kind of weird. Now, definitely, you can, again, I mean, alcoholic drinks, probably most children don't like the taste of beer, for example. 30% of women never like the taste of beer, interestingly. And so this is one of those things which is what you measure okay, and what people perceive are very different, because you measure things. The whole point of scientific measurement is that you're measuring something in a way that's context independent. And the whole point of human perception is that human perception doesn't exist really in a context independent state. Those of you who've been to America will know that very interesting American thing where the weather forecast doesn't just tell you the temperature, which is a scientific measure. It says feels like 75 degrees. And the reason for that is very important, which is actually what is hot and what isn't hot to a human is quite different to what is hot and not hot to a physicist. So, you know, I'm a fairly fat guy. Most of my ancestry is Northern European or Welsh or Scottish. I find it, I don't go into London if it gets up to a certain temperature, like sort of 30 degrees. I basically don't go into London. I find it intolerable. But I can walk around Phoenix, Arizona quite happily. And that's because humidity has a very major bearing on how hot you feel, as does the existence of a breeze, for example. As does, by the way, the presence of a swimming pool. So one of the reasons I always say, you know, if you're going somewhere like Spain or Italy in June or July, you know, try and go to a hotel. I was just booking a hotel in Italy because slightly bizarrely, I've been invited to go out and see Rick Rubin, the music producer, who wants to interview me for a podcast. And I said to my wife, I've only got one requirement here, which is a swimming pool. And she said, well, you don't always swim. I go, that's not the point. If I'm sitting by a swimming pool, the heat feels escapable. Whereas if I'm sitting in a field, it doesn't. You know, one of the reasons I think we spend summer at the beach is even if you don't go into the sea, you know it's there. You get a breeze, etc. And so the psychology of temperature, the psychology of taste, etc., they're all highly contextually variable. Whereas what science attempts to do is to measure something in a way that's context independent and universally true.
And that's not what we teach in marketing, right?
And say the non-replication crisis in the social sciences is really to be expected, because you wouldn't expect a lot of social science experiments to replicate perfectly.
Yeah, but that's not how we approach marketing usually. Like I promised I will leave you off the leash in just a bit, but just to set up the scene here, and I mean you can already feel here from Rory's initial remarks are that what we usually do in marketing, being it for private sector, being it for the NGO sector, is we do things by the book, right? To challenge Coca-Cola is we do the usual thing. Like we look at price, we look at quantity, we looked at product. But for you, marketing seems to be more, and also more driven by the insights of psychological behaviors, right? Or behavioralism to a certain degree, right?
I also think we've inherited from science a kind of idea of proportionality and trade-off. In other words, we almost have in our minds, when we try to be scientific, the idea of kind of the laws of thermodynamics. You know, heat cannot be created, or energy cannot be created or destroyed. Okay. And I think that's mentally limiting, because in psychology, you can create something out of nothing. You can create good out of bad. You can create better out of good. And I'll tell you a lovely story, actually, which is a perfect story to tell to this group, which is I was talking to a lady who's on a WPP group, which is called the Institute for Real Growth. And she's the head of partnerships for UNESCO. And she received a very large donation of Crocs, you know, those not very attractive shoes, but actually pretty practical and quite trendy. Okay. And now what she could have done, which would have been fine, by the way, I mean, no one would have fired her. No one would have said, God, you totally unimaginative idiot. She could have just found people without shoes and given them Crocs. And that would have been fine. But she created something out of nothing. She went to schools and she gave them, these are Crocs for kids, by the way, just to be clear, not for adults. And she said to various schools in the poorest areas, when the children come in for their first day of the school year, give each child a pair of Crocs. Let them choose a pair of Crocs. Now, that way, someone without shoes gets a pair of shoes, which was the original intention. But it also means they go home, to their village from school after their first day at school, and all their friends say, where did you get those Crocs from? And they said, they give you the Crocs when you go to school. So day 2, far more kids turn up at school. It's the second day of term. You're creating a habit. You're creating a social norm. You're creating a positive association with going to school, as it's a place where people give you things. Now, she achieved the first objective, the logical objective, which is how do we shoo people? But she also got it to achieve something else as well. And that's why creativity should be taken literally. Creativity is where you literally create something out of nothing.
Yet it's not how marketing is usually perceived, right?
No, it's not. And I mean, that, well, why that is a really interesting question, because I've decided to, you know, I think the next book I write might be called Stop Making Sense. And the point I'm making here is that the need to win arguments in all institutional decision making, okay, requires people to adopt a particular modus of thinking and of arguing, which is without them realizing it, actually inimical to the act of creativity.
So elaborate on that a little bit before maybe I leave you finally off the leash a little bit, but like elaborate, because like your theory of social change that you articulated before us before is very interesting, very close actually to the UNESCO story, right? The UNESCO story is not about only like reshoring people, but it's as you said, it's about changing behavior. And what we do with arguments in my books, and that's I think an insight I took from you, is when we win arguments, we want to change attitudes. But what we ultimately want to do is like
change
starting
behavior.
with Yes. So maybe you elaborate on that a little bit.
Yeah, I think that actually, I hope, okay, no one in the room has ever argued someone into sleeping with them or into entering a relationship with them. Okay.
I think you know our crowd very little, you know. If you think that. They try.
But actually, argument and persuasion are actually very, very different forces. And the urge to win an argument, in particular, by the way, the urge to humiliate your opposition, is deeply inimical to what is really persuasive. And I think, you know, this urge. So first of all, when you want to win an argument, you tend to adopt. Okay, there's a whole theory there. There's a book by people. Actually, let me show you the title of the book. I can
Robert
show it
Cialdini
on the screen. There's also a book by these 2 French anthropologists called, actually one of them is Hungarian, called Hugo Mercier and Dan Sperber, I think it is. And one of the things they argue is that the human brain evolved its faculty of reason for argument, for evaluating arguments, and for you know, encouraging other people to do other things, not to make decisions. So that the faculty we have, in a sense of, you know, of rationality, isn't really the mechanism that we've evolved to use to actually make real life decisions like who to marry, who's attractive. You know, I mean, you cannot persuade someone that someone is attractive. You know, they either feel it or they don't. You can't persuade someone that someone is funny. They either feel it or they don't. And so actually arguments are, in a sense, a very, very now you can use it to change people's minds, but in changing people's moods or behavior, it isn't. Maybe it's designed just to stop people doing foolish things. Maybe that's the only thing you can do with argument, is you can say don't. Okay. But actually, in encouraging people to do something new, argument's surprisingly ineffectual, actually.
But that's bad news for the political sector or the NGO sector, no? Like most of the think tanks, what do they do?
You could say it's good news, and because you don't need to win an argument. What you need to do is make the new behavior attractive, easy, social, normative, timely. And the attitude will follow as a byproduct of the behavior. So I don't think more that I've got an electric car, okay? Did I buy the electric car to save the planet? No, okay? Have I now, because I own an electric car, become slightly more conscious environmentally? Yes, to the extent that, and I'm not exaggerating here, I've got the Mustang Mach-E just for interest, okay, just to give you an idea of the sort of level of car, okay. If you gave me a Bentley, because I'd won one in a prize draw, 3 years ago, I would have been ecstatic, okay, and now I would feel actually compromised. I would feel uncertain, uncomfortable. Secondly, I'm thinking of trying to get solar panels attached to my house because I like the idea of my car running on sunshine. Okay. Is that, now we did a campaign in the UK, which was just called One Bin is Rubbish. And our argument from a behavioral perspective was extremely successful, by the way. Hundreds of thousands of people in London got a second bin as a product of that campaign. And our argument is your attitude to the environment is one thing, but just as Aristotle said, you become virtuous through practicing virtuous acts, okay? That actually it's the practice of virtue that makes you virtuous. You don't think virtuous thoughts and then act virtuously, I mean, it's worth noting that religion, okay, with the idea of things like hell and the idea that someone's watching you, okay, builds in a healthy dose of self-interest into desirable behaviors, And so the idea of one bin is rubbish is that if you put Greta Thunberg, probably an exaggeration, but if you put Greta Thunberg and you gave her a holiday villa where there was only one bin and there was only one sack of rubbish, then after 2 weeks, Greta's going to go, oh, sod it. I'll just chuck this banana peel in here with the cardboard box. Okay. And if you put Jeremy Clarkson in a house with 2 bins, he'll probably put the cardboard in one and the banana peel in the other, and then that's a success in itself. The fact that people are getting Teslas, it doesn't matter why they're doing it. Okay. As long as people are electrifying their cars and thinking about getting interesting electricity tariffs, which are very cheap at night and so on. The fact they're doing that's great. Now, the second benefit is, the first benefit is they're actually doing something, okay? The second benefit is by doing something, they become more conscious, more well-disposed, more likely in their conversation to hold generally pro-environmental positions on sustainability.
That's why I always tend to think that they have to make vegan food taste very good, no? Like the first
Yes.
thing is like you need to change. I mean, and it's a deep insight that in politics is not understood, and I hammered home this many times. Like you need to focus on behavioral changes first, because we can, and I think especially in the classical liberal sphere, is like the winning an argument is the core issue. Like to speak in Trump's terms, like the classical liberal tradition has the most books and the best books probably. Like the arguments are really refined. But the way of changing people into behave like a liberal is very difficult, obviously, for certain values, And so the behavioral change is never in the emphasis.
No, you're absolutely right. And actually, had we had a more Austrian world, I think had we had more Austrian school economics, where economists acknowledged that there was a large part of psychology is necessary in economics in order to understand what people do, we would have had a better world. But I think what we're doing is we're selecting people on their ability to win arguments and look rational. And we're promoting people, we're educating people, we're rewarding people for their ability to win arguments. And one of the problems there is that if you want to win an argument, you take what data is available, you cherry pick it, and you bash someone over the head, okay? If you want to solve a problem, generally you'll start not by using the data that already exists, but by asking for some different data. I'll give you an example of this, okay? This is a bit commercial, and you may not like it. But I was talking to people from a soft drinks manufacturer, and we made the point that, people stop drinking, let's say, fizzy orangeade, typically when they become teenagers. They still like it, but they stop drinking it. Okay. And my argument was, well,
so like Fanta, right?
Yeah, something exactly like
Okay.
that. And I said, what I want to know is, what do people actually drink if they go to a Coke freestyle machine, or they order a drink with their burger on a screen, as opposed to ordering something face to face? How does the pattern, the ratio of fizzy drink to Coca-Cola to water to Sprite, say, how does that change? So in other words, is it that actually people shift when they're 15, not because they suddenly prefer the taste of something, but because they just want to look older? Because that's now I'll give you an example of this. One of the things that McDonald's discovered very quickly after they installed these ordering screens, it's very interesting, by the way, if you've noticed that McDonald's went from almost no ordering screens to having screens in all their restaurants.
Basket size gets bigger.
Exactly. And they noticed really, really quickly that A, if you get people to pay by credit card, B, if you allow people to choose what to eat without making them feel hurried, and C, if you remove social embarrassment, people order more. One of the biggest discoveries, the number of particularly males who order two burgers in a meal for one has gone up massively. And so there was a social norm basically around, you have one burger and you can have fries and you can have, one other side dish and you can have a drink. Okay. But in a public realm, that's your norm. Once you're ordering on a screen, people have maybe a Big Mac and a cheeseburger. Maybe they don't have the fries, but people feel much, much happier ordering differently on a screen. I've always had a theory. I think this is true. Okay. If you found yourself in a toilet cubicle and there was a copy of Bild and there was a copy of the Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung, okay, you'd actually read Bild first. Is that probably fair?
That would be totally fair,
Yeah, okay.
Even I
that's
would
true
admit.
of me. If there was a copy of the Sun and a copy of the Times, I would read the Times. I'm not suggesting I'd only read the Sun. I'd probably read the Sun first, but I wouldn't come into the office carrying a copy of the Sun.
Yeah.
And so my point there was that what I wanted to know, I didn't want to win the argument. It's much closer to detective work where you want to solve a problem than it is to debate where you want to win an argument.
So I think there are two things. Like, let me just jump in there. Like, I think there are two things. First, of course, the behavioral change, and I think much of our sector and also the political sector doesn't focus on behavioral change. They think attitudinal change is doing the whole job, and I think that might be to a certain degree misguided. At least we should explore the other option. And the second thing is about status, right? Like, as you said, like, nobody wants to drink Fanta because they want to seem like an adult. Like, no adult drinks like Fanta, or that's like the social norm, right? And similarly, I think for some of our organizations, they might just have a bad rep, like being a classical liberal or whatsoever, like that is just, how can we improve the status might be something to think about, to really get out of the everyday marketing or communications work where it's like almost like so rigid that we kill all sort of creativity. And one last point before you jump in.
But by the way,
please.
One political movement which I've always had great sympathy with, which, by the way, Adam Smith would agree with. Funnily enough, so did Milton Friedman, so did Churchill, is Georgism. Okay. Now, interestingly, I think you can extend Georgism to make a kind of classical liberal argument for sustainability, which is high rates of tax on non-renewable energy. And the argument in Georgism is that if you own land, you pay. In a sense, the argument, the justice argument for Georgism is no one has a right to monopolize land. It's just rent seeking. It's it's not actually value. It's not actually adding value. It's just effectively extracting rent from the creation of a community which was created by the effort of others. You just happen to sit there and wait for it to grow. Or in many cases, you own land and someone opens a railway station nearby and you make a fortune through no effort of your own. And the other argument through natural justice for Georgism is that that nobody has a right to own oil or land without paying tax on the unimproved value of it, simply because that is the fruits of our labors should be actually given to us. In other words, we should be rewarded for value we create, but we should be taxed on value we extract. And you could make a really interesting Georgist case for saying, look, mate, if you put solar panels and windmills on your land, you get to keep all the electricity for free. But if someone's extracting non-renewable crude oil out of the ground, actually that should be taxed.
Yeah, you trigger my political philosophy side there. Like just a one side comment. We can't go too much down the road of Georgism, but obviously Georgism doesn't, like in my books, has a problem of defining resources, and I think resources are created by the human mind. Just one example, I think how also you would agree. Humans turned black sticky stuff that is very much useless and like polluting our garden, if we have one, into a resource for energy, namely oil. Oil, without us discovering a purpose for it and giving it meaning, is black sticky stuff. Is useless. It's actually a pollutant, so it's not good. And so all natural resource, and it's I think the flaw of Georgism, is actually constructed by human beings. There is no natural resource itself. The resource is defined by the human cognition, a point that Julian Simon always made in his book, The Ultimate Resource. But anyways, that's just a critique of Georgism right there. In any case, I wanted to add one third point that is less on the political philosophy side, more on the communication side, is when we talk and we want to win arguments.
One extra point, by the way, which is when people are arguing, there is usually a status component involved in the argument. They're arguing a particular point of view, not because they believe it sincerely, but because they believe that holding that opinion, luxury beliefs is the phrase that Rob Henderson created. And I've had very interesting discussions about this, which is one of the things I get very angry with in environmentalism is the anti-car movement. And I'm totally in favor of cars becoming cleaner, maybe smaller, more efficient, electrically powered, whatever it may be. Totally in favor of all that. But the fundamental attack on the autonomous vehicle is a position which you can only hold if you live in the center of a very well-funded large city in the developing world, and if you are already possessed of large amounts of status to begin with. Because if you're the Prime Minister, or you're the Mayor of Hamburg, or you're the Chief Executive of the BBC, and you turn up to work on a folding bicycle, okay, everyone knows that's a choice, not a compromise, and therefore it elevates your status. If you work at Pizza Hut and you turn up to work on a bike, it means you can't afford a car, okay? And one of the most interesting groups, for example, in this, even among people of very high status, one of the things you'll notice about cycling is it's really, really white, okay, right? Now, I've spoken to various people like this, both Indians, people of Nigerian ancestry, people of Ghanaian ancestry, who say, well, apart from anything else, nobody qualified as a thoracic surgeon in Nigeria so they could move to London and own a bicycle, okay? They did it because they wanted a Merc, okay? That's the first point, that depending on where you come from, what your origins are, old money versus newer money, etc., all these things mean something completely different. And the bike is only a status enhancing tool to maybe 5% of the population. But also, I will be a bit Georgist here. One of the problems of mass transportation is it gives huge gains to the people who happen to own land next to transport hubs. Because your public transport determines where you walk, and it concentrates people very heavily in certain areas. And those areas, most of the gains in retail go to the landowner, they don't go to the shopkeeper. Now, the great thing with I would argue, okay, I think this is possibly true. We tend to think the Americans have a lot of cars because they're rich. I'm not sure that America isn't rich because Americans have got a lot of cars. by which I mean you can open a business anywhere in the middle of the desert, okay? And if what you offer is good enough, people will come to you. I think there's, I think that, there's a fundamental question where businesses need actually cars in order to function to an extraordinarily high degree, that without the car driving customer, a lot of businesses would just disappear. Without vans, the whole country would collapse. So this anti what you might call private transport thing, I think is done for show. I don't think it's even remotely practical or sensible. And it just annoys the 90% of the population who, for perfectly solid reasons, can't afford to live in a place where you don't need a car.
Yeah, I think that I mean the anti-car sentiment, without going too deep into that, is, I mean, because it impacts city planning and urban planning so much. Like the car lobby, just like you go to the city in Central Europe, and the city just looks very different from a city in the United States, which has been built around a car. It's not livable, not walkable, livable for sure, but not walkable. So lots of things happen.
I think in the US, I think a lot of that was zoning. Actually,
sure.
As a liberal, I tend to say that what they talk about in terms of American city planning is the missing middle. Is you get kind of single-story suburbia, and then you get high rises. And what the American city is missing is that bit in between, which is kind of, terraced houses with shops underneath. There's a kind of missing middle there somehow, I think.
Yeah, because there are reasons of density and zoning, as you said. Anyways, yeah. I have to put you back to the communications issues. As you can see, he's Rory is a real maverick. You can discuss almost any topic with him. But now getting back to one of the questions, and then I basically let you also share some of the slides that you prepared. But one question that I still had was relating to these winning arguments. And I think marketeers are also trained to a certain degree to winning arguments with other departments in the company, right?
Yes. So you've spotted, this was exactly my next point, which is that if you only allow marketers to do things that you can justify in advance, about 50% of their value, let's say, the exploratory value of marketing is completely destroyed. And I think there's a wider problem.
Explain this.
Okay, I think there's a wider problem in business, which is that nobody can make a decision anymore on their own. Literally nothing. Okay. One of the reasons I always thought it was weird that I spent so much time planning my business travel, which was relatively trivial. Which train to take to get to Cannes or something. Okay. I suddenly realized it was partly because it was one of the very few remaining things where I actually got to make a choice on my own. And the fact that every decision is taken by a committee, that finance have the right of veto over more or less anything, HR have the right of veto over more or less anything, nobody can hire anybody, nobody can fire anybody, okay, without first making an argument for it, I think is deeply damaging, because I think that even though, okay, it does prevent some of the worst excesses of, corruption, favoritism, systematic bias in hiring, I accept that, okay. But the hidden price we pay is that nobody can ever do anything strange on a hunch. And over time, it's accidental discoveries that prove more valuable than intentional discoveries. Penicillin, Viagra, etc. Okay, I was talking to someone at Merck, that's the American Merck, not the German Merck pharmaceutical company. Their most successful drug is an immunotherapy. Was it developed as an immunotherapy? Nope. A separate part of the company was trying to develop an immunosuppressant drug for conditions like arthritis, rheumatoid arthritis, which is where your immune system attacks your own body, effectively. Asthma may be something similar. Okay, they were trying to develop an immunosuppressant and accidentally developed something which was the worst thing imaginable, which was an immune boosting drug. So they immediately shelved that until 5 years later, people working on immunotherapy against cancers heard about it and said, But that disastrous drug for you is exactly what we're looking for. And if you only allow people to take the credit for intentional, what they were intending to do, okay, and you require that everybody has a clear definition of both what the purpose of an activity is and what they hope to derive from it, and the only value you can account for is the extent to which something accomplished something you had defined in advance, then you're massively limiting your exposure to upside optionality. And I think the fact that
how many organizations are set up.
Requires an argument, the fact that everything requires a bloody argument in a business sense, prevents people from being creative. Simple as that. Because it's impossible to be creative, I think, or at least it makes the act of creativity unbelievably tiring, because for every moment you spend being creative, you now have to spend 7 moments, 7 times the time, effectively reverse engineering your idea.
In our bubble, that's to the, I mean, no offense, but obviously the finance department or something like that, or the
Yes.
accountants, or the, the executive level to a certain degree. Everything has to be done by argumentation, right? And that's, I think, when you do these nonprofit marketing courses or nonprofit communication courses, it's a lot of by the book, right? We develop the argument that in the end is, by the standard beliefs, will lead us to this and this outcome, but that's playing it safe. But the creativity certainly goes out the window, right? Because you never can take the audacious bet or whatsoever, because how would you justify it to the other departments?
Interestingly, Amazon have a phrase which I think is quite intelligent, which is, they'll just say as shorthand, they'll say, I've had this idea. And before someone will say, please justify your idea, someone will say, go and try that, because it's a two-way door. And a two-way door is simply one where you can try it and then reverse it if it doesn't work. In other words, it isn't a ratchet, it isn't a heavy commitment, it's simply exploratory. Now, you could argue that, I think that if you hire 10 people, okay, 3 of them should be wild cards on the basis that, you're going to lose 3 of them in the next 4 years anyway, right? Okay, there's no particular cost to actually that, and the upside is potentially high, potentially limitless. And so I think the two-way door is a really intelligent phrase, just to say you should be able to go to finance and say, the reason I want to do it is because it's a two-way door,
Yeah, but in our sector, I would say in politics as well as the nonprofit or NGO sector, it's very similar to, in the sense that it's even worse than private businesses, because in the private sector, you can also be non-serious. You can, like, even you have Amazon, or you have companies that just try stuff out. Here you have a sector, and I don't know how much you interact with them in fact, but like, it's very serious all the time. And we have this urge to be serious and the urge to not go outside of the ordinary playbook, right?
No, and also the extent to which you'll get blamed for failure is not a proportion of how bad the failure is. Because if you fail rationally, if you fail conventionally, your career survives. If you succeed conventionally, your career does very well, okay? If you fail unconventionally, that's when it's a firing offense. And as a result, the asymmetry of incentives within organizations, now I probably mentioned the last time we spoke that what bees do, that about 20% of bees ignore the waggle dance. There's this wonderful dance which maximizes pollen and nectar collecting, where the bees share with the other bees, where there's a reliable source of nectar and pollen. And off they go, they watch the dance, they obey the instruction, okay? It's very clever, by the way, because the quality of the supply determines the length of the dance. So if you only glance up at various bees doing a dance, you're more likely to notice bees doing a long dance than bees doing a brief dance. And so more bees consequently go to the most promising areas of supply. And it's completely necessary. But after 20 million years of bee evolution, they were at first surprised to notice that the hive tolerated a certain amount of deviance. And then they modeled it as a complex system, and they realized that without the random bees. Now, just to be clear, it's absolutely essential that the random bees, in order to justify their existence, report back on their findings. So they have to be prepared to do a dance and share what they've found. Okay. But without the random bees continually updating the hive in terms of finding out, not exploiting what you do know, but exploring what you don't, the hive gets trapped in a local maximum and it starves to death.
I mean, you describe German society to a certain degree. We lack the random bees, I have to say. But
yeah, no. Well, I think one of the interesting things is if bees had a personality, the two classes of bee would really hate each other. But actually, the way to look at it is these two processes are actually complementary. It's a yin and yang. It's a unity of opposites. You know, that provided that the random bees share, okay, and share honestly their discoveries, they don't keep them secret to themselves, then the explore exploit thing isn't really, it's often called the explore exploit trade-off, but it's not actually a trade-off. It's actually it's two sides of the same coin in a way. And I think it's a failure of the human perception to see it as a trade-off.
So in other words, organizations need the mavericks or the explorer bees, right?
You certainly need a budgetary system where you accept that if you're measuring an obedient waggle dance bee, it's a very simple calculation, isn't it? It is energy collected in excess of energy expended in its collection, and that's your profit margin, effectively. But if you're measuring the rogue bees, you need to look at it over a greater time scale, and you shouldn't punish a rogue bee for quite often coming back empty-handed. Because the rogue bee payoff is that one journey in 500, in terms of information being carried back, outweighs the value of, of 10,000 routine bee journeys, because it's suddenly saying, hey, this whole new field's come into pollen or whatever.
Yeah. And here it comes in, like, where in our sector this budget line to justify this is
just
not happening.
So this business of quarterly reporting and the business where effectively businesses amass data for the purpose of reporting to their shareholders is at some level deeply damaging to what businesses do, because it encourages you to take the random bees off random bee duty and get them exploiting the pre-existing crop, even though actually, in 3 days' time, some cows could break into that field and eat all the flowers.
Yeah. And again, in our sector, this is very dominant. Like, whenever you become part of an organization, you get basically like.
So I think last time, one of the things I suggested is that charities could reasonably pool a budget for experimentation. Now, provided that the useful discoveries were shared equally among all contributors, because most charities are and they aren't competitors. I mean, the extent to which charities are competitors is a really complicated. I mean, yes, at one level, everybody competes with everybody else for available income. Okay, at another level, a kind of donkey sanctuary isn't really competing with Oxfam. I mean, yes and no. Okay. But if you look at the breakthroughs in charity fundraising, and this is an interesting question, how frequently it is that only one or two things determine everything. So in car sales, it was really the invention of personal contract hire, where you paid the depreciation on a new car rather than having to buy the car up front. That financial thing changed the whole car industry. Okay. There are a hell of a lot of people who wouldn't dream of spending £40,000 on a car, who'd happily pay £400 a month for a car on contract hire, even though ostensibly it's basically the same outcome. Okay. In charities, enclosing a pen, direct debit, the request for a very small direct debit, which you could then nudge people to increase, for example. There are few ideas like that which have proved unbelievably effective for the whole sector. And as a consequence, you have to argue that the charity sector would be well advised to spend some of its time looking for the next one.
Yep. There, I mean, you spot an interesting difference between some of our sector or in the charity sector. The charity sector, of course, they are non-competitive in a certain degree. They would benefit by discovery. But now let's look at ours as almost political or a hybrid political sector. So to a certain degree, we compete against other causes. So we want to have the edge over other, like let's say, other inclinations, other ideology is a big word, but other causes, right? So there is a competition in a scarce space to a certain degree, and their positive sum game reasoning doesn't always work. So I don't see that, let's take for some of the most politicized organizations that all political parties in a given country are pooling resources to increase their whatever marketing behavior or their experimentation behavior, right, in political marketing. That's not happening because it's competitive. Politics is always a zero-sum game, right?
Yes.
So, and that's why the analogy between the charities and part of what we do in NGOs and in even political organizations might not be working, right? Because we cannot pool resources and we don't have the budget line because also a lot of public funding. So in a private funding, you fund you can fund such a budget line. We
Yes.
simply, and that's why the sector remains one of the least innovative sectors in that I see for marketing. I have a marketing background. I saw private companies, FMCG. I see politics, and which is more innovative than the NGO sector. And then the NGO sector, which is the most serious, the most play by the book, and the least playful, right? If you would have to name one playful actor in the space, I don't know. It's very hard to name actually one.
The playful question is very interesting in politics, actually, because you're not allowed to be playful in politics, really. And one of the things that annoys me about politics is that whenever someone comes up with an idea which is genuinely quite useful, that appeals to me, quite often they're ridiculed for doing something trivial. So if you discuss tax rates, that's considered to be an absolutely serious, that is absolutely. I had an argument with the political editor of the Financial Times about this, that we had a prime minister called John Major, and he was widely ridiculed for introducing something called the cones hotline, which enabled you to report places where there were stupid cones blocking the road when no one was working. And it also gave you advance information about where. Now, okay, by the way, that still exists, that phone line, okay, which is more than you can say for most things that were done in 1994 or whatever, okay. But he was totally ridiculed for this. Like, well, yeah, it's not a cancer cure, but it's something. Our current prime minister has been slightly ridiculed because, funnily enough, his parents are pharmacists, or his mother is a pharmacist. And he's proposing simply that pharmacists in the UK should be allowed to prescribe antibiotics. Now, that's considered almost a sort of, what a trivial, stupid idea. I don't think it's trivial at all, because if you can get people to go to the pharmacist before they go to the doctor, it will relieve a huge amount of strain on the medical profession, okay, on GPs. And one of the reasons people go to the doctor first before they go to the pharmacist is they go, well, I need antibiotics. They often don't, by the way. I need antibiotics, and there's no point in going to the chemist because they can't give me any. And, so his idea is actually a really, really good idea. Okay, it stops the pharmacist being slightly stigmatized as a second-class doctor. And there are loads of conditions where a visit to the pharmacist will be all you need, because a lot of the time you're providing reassurance, you're not really providing actual treatment. There's a lot of it about, what you've got is a condition called so and so, and once they name the condition, you're basically happy. And so I think that one of the weird things is, I'll give you an idea which strikes me as absolutely obvious, which comes out of a playful thought. You shouldn't actually ever cut tax rates. Okay, what you should do is you should give people a rebate at the end of the year. One, because it'll get far more appreciation than a tax cut. After 2 years, people forget the new rate of tax. Okay. Secondly, I think it's very good for poorer people to have a lump sum every year. I think it makes a difference in a way that regular increments don't. I inherited when I was about 28, a sum of a few £1,000s, okay, which transformed my life because I no longer had to live, hand to mouth, if you like. But thirdly, it means that if something really shit happens, okay, like a country invades Ukraine, for example, for no readily apparent reason, you don't have to put tax rates up. You can just say, because of these exceptional circumstances, we won't be paying a rebate this year. And people are going to go, yeah, okay, fair enough. It's a bit weird. It's not usual.
Yeah.
Fourthly, when you paid the rebate beforehand, you could ask people to pledge 50% of their rebate to the National Health Service. Because it's much, much easier to get people to give you money by saying, I occasionally do a speaking engagement and they go, do you want the money, or do you want the money paid into charity? Okay. Now I'll go, oh, go on, make it as a donation to so and so. Now it's 10 times easier for me to say that than it is for me to take the money, pay it into my bank account, and then write a check to the charity.
Yeah, I think that's a brilliant example of like the way you approach things, right? That's from the behavioral attitude, and because like here's a personal story. Like in a sense, like I'm from the political party in Germany that has advocated for lowering taxes for forever. That's basically our USP.
Oh, is this
but we never debated the topic of rebates. Although, of course, if you think about it from behavioral economics perspective, there might be all the effects that you are talking about, but it never enters into the political discourse. Although tax reform is our main political agenda point. And I think that's just like
is that the Free Democratic Party? Is it in general?
Yeah. It's the FDP.
Yeah, no, they're very interesting, because the other point I'd make is it also forces people who say, I want to pay more tax, it forces them to put their money where their mouth is. Because you can say, now, by the way, you wouldn't say this, okay, to a family with 6 kids, all right? You wouldn't say, well, if you think you should pay more tax, why don't you just refuse to take your tax rebate, okay? But if you have a left-wing couple, okay, with no kids, okay, who are taking their 3rd holiday of the year, and they say, well, I think we should all be paying more tax, you can reasonably say to them, well, are you actually donating your tax rebate? And, it should be, maybe, if you donate your tax rebate, it should be made a matter of public record, so you can gain reputationally from it.
Yeah, no, I think there are many like practical considerations why this might run out, because how would you determine the optimal tax rate and stuff. But besides that, like just a way of thinking about it.
Actually, in a sense, if you think about it, the tax rate doesn't really take account of reputation. Takes account of wider context. Okay, in that someone with 4 kids. Okay, you wouldn't dream of suggesting they didn't take their tax rebate. They need all the money they can, okay? A childless couple on the same income, you might. Now, the tax system doesn't actually discriminate between those two people. It doesn't really acknowledge having children at all, which is, in my opinion, ridiculous, okay? But the reputation system would. The reputation system would be, look, mate, you've just come back from your 3rd holiday of the year in bloody Puerto Rico. I think if anybody can afford to give money to the NHS, it's you.
Oh, yeah, no. And again, like that's why I love your work so much, because it really thinks about behavioral changes, or like behavioralism and status games, and like how we can transform our institutions. Because I mean, the most dry political discussion is tax reform, but nevertheless, in the last 50-60 years, nobody came up with like a rebate system. At least the first time I'm hearing it, and
I'll give you another one, which is Roger L. Martin, who's a great business writer, by the way, who I really recommend. He tried to get the Conservative government of Canada to have a tax system where, instead of the first, let's say, 8,000 Canadian dollars of your annual income being tax-free, instead it was a lifetime system where the first 200,000 Canadian dollars you earned in your lifetime were tax-free. And so he said you should forward weight this tax rebate so that it's actually, in other words, it's much more expensive being young than it is being old, I would argue. In all kinds of ways, you earn less, but also there are more things you need to acquire. And I thought that was a really, really interesting reframing of it as well.
I mean, in the end, it comes back to what you said about the explorer bees, right? Like in politics, we don't have explorer bees to a certain degree, like that we just let off and like explore with those small little things. It doesn't exist.
We had a few in Britain. There was a very interesting guy who would have been absolutely chime with your economic and political ideas in terms of the Free Democrats. There was a guy called Sir Alfred Sherman, who was a kind of wacko advisor to Margaret Thatcher. And most of the things he proposed never got done because they frightened civil servants too much. One of his big things was that you concrete over commuter railways and you run coaches on them. Now, my view is that at the very least, they should have taken one railway and they should have tried that. You know, it wasn't strictly speaking a two-way door, although, to be honest, you could have kept the tracks in place, possibly, I don't know, okay? But that was an interesting idea, which is what happens if you do that. You get huge frequency. If a bus breaks down, the other bus just drives around it. You'd also probably get innovation where some people would run super luxury buses, which seated 25 people and charged a lot of money, and other people would run sort of, you know, standing only buses, which were cheaper. So, you know, that was certainly the kind of experiment which governments should be doing, just to see what happens, because we can't fully predict. You know, I'd like to take for e-commerce, I'd like to take an area of the UK, you know, say Kent or Wales or somewhere, probably a peninsula, and just experiment with installing an open access locker system for delivery and distribution. Yeah, just to see how it works. Because, you know, the last mile of e-commerce is making e-commerce in terms of all kinds of things, you know, energy efficiency, simple affordability. It's making it kind of unsustainable.
Yeah.
Whereas if you have a locker system, generally that problem goes away.
No, Amazon now cooperates with small little corner shops, and then just lets them do the last mile delivery because they will build it to build their brand in the local community. So they source it out to solve the last day delivery, and the benefit for the local entrepreneur of a corner shop.
They get footfall.
Yeah, exactly. So, you know, they are thinking in that way. But again, like in politics, rather different. Just let me make one little announcement because we are running like at the hour already. As you can see, Rory is very hard to tame, but also you get so many like different angles with him. So in case anyone wants to chime in the discussion, you can also just raise your hand on Zoom or let us know in the chat. Don't worry about anything. We can go in all sorts of directions with him. So just you can do so, and otherwise we just keep continuing. And Rory, you were already going to the next alley, so you were just having a deep breath. So what's on your mind?
No, simply this requirement that if you only try things where they make sense in advance, if you confine yourself, if you make an absolute uncrossable hurdle of sense making for every single business venture, then the most interesting businesses would never have happened. The other one being, of course, that, you know, perception is very different from physics, in that in physics there's an optimal place to be, and the optimal place to be is where you want everybody to be. In marketing, there's a huge value to differentiation, which means that, by the way, the opposite of a good idea in marketing can be not wrong, but another good idea. You know, I always tell a very funny story about this, which is slightly embarrassing, but nonetheless funny, which is I was about to give a talk on stage. I was wearing beige trousers, and I go to the loo before I give the talk, and I turn on the tap, and the tap basically fires water all over the front of my trousers.
We have all been there.
We've all been there. What do I do? Okay. So I try the hand dryer, and the hand dryer is absolutely useless. I'd have to stand there for about 20 minutes and miss the start of my talk. I go out wondering whether just to make a run for it, and then it starts to rain, and it rains really heavily. So I just walked out into the street and stood in the rain for 4 minutes. Now, admittedly, when I was on stage, people thought, why has this man just fallen into a swimming pool? But it was better than the alternative. Okay. And in the same way, what happens is that, you know, often in marketing, there's a great sweet place to be, but the great place gets overcrowded, so you want to be somewhere completely different. And because of the vagaries of human perception, there are two great ways to check into a hotel. One of them is totally automated, where you don't see a person and where, you just use your phone as the key to your room. And the other ones where you're greeted by a person and they take you up to the room and show you how the television works. They're both fantastic ways to check into a hotel. Okay. They're completely at odds with each other.
Yeah, maybe to segue that differentiation part, because of course, as you said, scientific thinking makes you think that there's one universal, unique solution, right? And the marketing solution, the marketing way of thinking is, well, there could be multiple equilibria, right? And so
Yes.
here's a question by Milena in the chat, and it's more tactical, but I mean, you will answer it in your own way. If you have a brand, it seems like that's a puzzle for having differentiation, right? Because with a brand, you want to have one tone of voice for the whole organization. But if you have many different target audiences, you might just adjust your tone of voice all the time, right? And like be flexible. So the puzzle of differentiation while keeping the tone of voice for a brand, how do you think about somebody who has seen so many brands in action?
It's a really interesting question, which is, we manage in a way to retain our personality while talking differently to different people. And I agree that there are certain tonalities there are certain brands which are kind of monolithic, I think. And there are certain Apple is the most monolithic of the lot, isn't it? And that's because you either buy into this thing wholesale or you don't. Broadly speaking, Apple communicates in absolutely one voice only, to a point of view which is almost slightly creepy. I think, of course, in discrete media, you equally, the medium often helps you there, because you wouldn't expect someone on TikTok. You wouldn't expect British Airways on TikTok to communicate in the same way as British Airways in the Financial Times. And it's worth noting, by the way, that actually the same people may see BA in the Financial Times and see BA on TikTok. I don't know how great the overlap between those two media is, but there will be a tiny amount of overlap. But to some extent, again, this is where context matters. You're not necessarily being inconsistent, because there's TikTok you and there's Financial Times you. And if I went to a Financial Times conference, I probably wouldn't say fuck very often. Whereas if I went to a TikTok marketing conference, I probably would, And actually, I think because of that, no one thinks it weird if you expect an off-duty policeman to be slightly different in terms of their conversation to an on-duty policeman. And I think humans actually account for that. So what you should judge is the consistency of the takeout, rather than the consistency of the stimulus.
Yeah, I think that's a good way to think about it. Your personality also changes all the time.
The famously difficult example where you have two different audiences simultaneously is the best man speech at a wedding, where you have a load of people who are the same age as the best man or best woman, and for whom he wants to tell dirty jokes, perhaps, or tell stories about the bride or bridegroom's past behavior. But you've also got kind of, the bride's parents and the bride's grandparents, and, and it's difficult to do. I mean, sometimes you can do it by sort of coding. I mean, a classic example is there's a very weird British thing called pantomime, which is a kind of, and what you see, pantomime is ostensibly for children, but you get very clever adult jokes being told to the parents in a way that all the parents laughed and the children couldn't understand why.
Okay, but I love the analogy that different personalities. I mean, that's we expect different personalities on a different medium. So
yeah,
I think
exactly. Yeah.
I mean, there's the human intuition that is in favor of you. So shouldn't be worrying too much here, Mirena. Basically relating to your question.
No, because I think American Express was quite a monolithic brand. Luxury goods brands tend to be, I am what I am. This is it. Because in a sense that they are what they are. You don't expect to laugh at a kind of Chanel advertisement. So obviously the extent to which you're monolithic or the extent to which, but I think the trick is you can make a multifaceted diamond without splitting the diamond. I think you can do it. I'm not saying it's necessarily easy. You know, if someone came to me and said you have to do something for American Express on TikTok, I would you know, actually have a bit of a quandary for a few days. You know, but I think it can be done.
Yeah, I tend to agree. Although I never checked American Express on TikTok. But anyways, being
by the
mindful
way,
of your...
a very interesting question. Mark Ritson always makes the point that two of the most underexplored areas of brand building are sonic and auditory identity and brand partnerships. And I'm a big fan of brand partnerships. I think that actually, by the way, in the charitable sector, I would like to see more partnership activity. But one of the stupid things people occasionally say is they say, oh, you don't want to do brand partnerships because they dilute your brand. And I said, that's a bit like me saying that my having friends dilutes my personality. It sounds plausible, but I just don't think it works like that.
But do you mean by brand partnerships? Because we had a discussion on our very first session whether, for example, political almost ideologies need like an ambassador, right? Like Nike needs Serena Williams, right? Like that's the representation of the brand idea. And I think there is something like deeply about how humans connect with something. They can only connect with the concrete, like François Julien always makes that argument, and we cannot connect with the universal, right? A universal idea, like the idea of freedom, is so abstract, you cannot connect. But you can connect to somebody who lives the value, or like whatever, who represents that idea. So we cannot connect to the values of Nike, of excellence whatsoever, but we can connect to Serena Williams and her excellency. Or
this is a really interesting discussion. But logically, you might say, we as humans have a million years of evolved experience in knowing which person to trust. We don't have a million years of evolved experience in knowing which second-hand car to buy. And it's an interesting question, which is, I've always wanted to do, it's too late now because my mother's dead, but my mother was a very, very good judge of personality for the most part, and a very good judge of character. She you know, she could tell someone
mothers usually are, yeah.
She could have a kind of, she could tell someone was having an extramarital affair from like 500 yards, you know. And the interesting thing is, if my mother went to buy a second-hand car, she'd make the decision based on the seller, not on the car, because she knew a lot about people and didn't know much about cars. Now, if a car expert goes to buy a second-hand car, he ignores the seller and looks at the car. Now, the best solution would undoubtedly be a mixture of the two, because a thoroughly honest seller might unwittingly be selling a car which has something wrong with it. But equally, a totally dishonest person, okay, might, without knowing it, be selling quite a good car. Okay, right. Now, what I'm saying is that it's not irrelevant to take into account the personality of the salesman in deciding what to buy. Because we're very good at judging people, and, you know, someone who seems to us as an honest, likable, trustworthy, and a person who is sensitive to their reputation is unlikely to be personally happy selling a bad product, for example.
Yeah, I mean, although Fabian challenges to a certain degree, he writes like, do we really know something about the other person? Like, you know, are we good at judging? And like, funny example, because you bring that up, because today I had a discussion with my mom. I was like urging them to buy a Tesla, and she says like, no, I won't buy anything from Elon Musk. So she just distrusts the character.
Funny enough, Elon, having created the electric car industry, is also creating his competitors, because my brother's wife is exactly the same. My brother isn't allowed to buy a Tesla because his wife doesn't like Elon Musk.
Yeah, so
there's a bit of me which goes, actually, if we investigated them all, okay. I mean, everybody from Isaac Newton to, you know, Thomas Edison, to, you know, actually, Bill Gates, you know, relatively likable. Steve Jobs was an arsehole. I mean, you know, let's be absolutely candid about this. I've spoken to quite a few people who worked with him and knew him well personally. I never met him myself, but they will talk to you for about 20 minutes about what a remarkable person he was to work with. But they always end the 20 minutes with, by the way, on a personal level, he was an absolute arsehole. He would deliberately humiliate people in meetings for, out of almost sort of sadistic reasons and so on and so forth.
But the brand of Apple was not associated with Steve, like not that exclusivity like Elon Musk. And I think coming back to the Nike example, right? Like to relate to the brand of Nike is probably much more difficult than to the brand. That's why the whole ambassador thing started, right? Why do they buy these expensive contracts with Cristiano Ronaldo and whatnot? And so our discussion was in the past, like for example, of human rights or UNICEF or of whatever liberalism as an ideology. Like there needs to be a representative in a sense to make the concreteness of the idea so that people can also relate to the this trust element or the concreteness, because the ideas of liberalism, as much as many brands, is abstract. For some brands, they try to build a foundational myth, a story around them to overcome that, but most of the time the brand value proposition is abstract the same way that political ideas are abstract. And so therefore we need, as you said, like brand partnerships or almost like influencers to represent.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things I love to do, one of the things I notice about politics is that the press has taught politicians that being absolutely on message and being absolutely consistent from one person in a party to another is essential, because if you show any deviation from this, the press will be unpleasant to you. Okay. What I also notice is that retired politicians come across as really quite sane and likable people in a way that current politicians aren't, for the simple reason that the retired politicians will say things like, I'm never quite sure what the right thing to do is here. I've seen evidence for one thing, evidence for another, and I don't know. Or they'll go, I think we were right about this, but on the other hand, I think we were wrong about that. Now, if current politicians were allowed to have that conversation, the press would still have a go at them, and they'd stop doing it because they're paranoid about press coverage. I think the public would like them more, actually.
Interestingly, because we had the same talk with somebody who is a former politician, and he wrote a book about how to play the media, and his core phrase is on message in volume over time. So
yes,
that is how you play the media. So you basically, to a certain degree, criticize his view, but on the other side, you confirm it, right? That this is the way the media is run, and the way
yeah, I mean, it's there are all these cases, by the way, where no one. Economics is terribly damaging because it basically limits creativity, because it posits a tax cut as being identical to a rebate. Now, in about 10 different ways, they're very, very different. For example, it's different in money off and value on. Actually, that's just one example. It assumes, that things are the same. Oh, I'll give you one example. Okay, this isn't quite parity, but Liz Truss and a very sort of libertarian government that briefly, before they got kicked out internally, ran in the UK, they got rid of the top rate of tax. Okay, and that caused a general sort of absolute kickback. What they should have done, which would have had a completely different reception, was significantly increase the point at which that top rate of tax became payable. Because you're getting to a point now where sort of, headmasters of state schools are paying the top rate of tax. Well, it was never really intended for, that kind of person. And, they made, that was an absolutely classic case of ideology triumphing over expediency, really. They could have achieved the same thing with 10% of the opprobrium if they just said, we think it's ridiculous. Because most people would have said, do you think a school headmaster should be highly taxed? No. Yeah.
No. And that's just many of the dead weight loss that is operating in that system.
Completely.
Yeah. Anyways, we are very mindful of your time, Rory, and we know that you are a very busy man. So let me just close with one question that I have to you, and that is about the role that you see in stories for for us? I know this is a big topic, just a quick, how do you think about storytelling in marketing? Because it's a big trend. Is it overrated or underrated? Because I hear it all the time. I do it myself. We are having a seminar on storytelling very soon. So I just want to hear from you. What do you think is the role of stories and over or
They
underrated?
have a magical role psychologically. I always think it's very dubious where people decry information as being anecdotal, because important information probably doesn't arise from averaging or aggregation. The important information is information that you know that other people don't, or it's information that is not what you expect. Okay, so I'm very sympathetic to anecdotes as a form of data. Okay, I don't believe that anecdote is the signal of data, because penicillin started off as being anecdotal. Viagra started off as being anecdotal, etc. And there's also something clearly special about stories in that I sometimes describe them as the human mind's equivalent of PDF files. They're both storable and readable and shareable. And it's information in a form not that's necessarily numerically quantifiable or capable of analysis. It's a different kind of information, which is information that it's important to hold in mind, because it teaches you that sometimes the unexpected happens, or that something unexpected is about to happen, or that there's a really unusual trend here where an anecdotal story. I'll give you an anecdotal story, which is that people in the UK are trading down from luxury cars like Jaguars and Audis and buying electric Skodas like the Skoda Enyaq. Okay, now I don't as yet have any data on it, but that is a story which is worth investigating more, because nobody developing electric Skodas probably thought that the target audience for the Skoda Enyaq would include Jaguar drivers. And so the fact that stories actually grab our attention is probably evidence of an evolved instinct that knows what information is really important. Gossip, by the way, is important because it's information you know that other people don't. Okay, so gossip is much more important. If you're an entrepreneur, knowing something that your competitors don't know is much more valuable than knowing something your competitors know already. Okay.
Yeah, there are great books actually on gossip and civilization and how gossip allows.
Gossip is hugely important, unbelievably important. When I was at school, there was a boy who was probably under 16 or only just 16, who started having an affair with a much older female teacher. Well, when I say much older, she was probably 25. Okay.
Still.
And this started as a joke, that because people had spotted they got on quite well or something and started making a joke that she's your girlfriend. And then two of the boys followed this young boy of 15, 16 one day, ducking into shop doorways. And they followed him down to the other end of town, where he ended up outside this teacher's house, rang on the doorbell, the door was opened, and they saw them embracing behind the frosted glass. And I remember
embracing behind the frosted glass.
Yeah, the frosted glass of the door.
Oh, yeah.
I remember saying, I feel slightly sorry for those two kids, because nothing that happens to them in the rest of their life is going to be as exciting as the moment they ran back to school and said, "You'll never guess what we've just seen." Nothing that happens. They could win the pools, they could do anything. Being the possessor of that kind of information is just, nothing. The rest of that, their wedding day won't be as good. Their wedding day will not be as good as the day they ran back up Mono Street and said, "Hey, you never guess what we've just seen."
And I certainly feel after every time I talk to you that possessing that knowledge makes me the cool kid at school. Anyways, thanks, Rory. You spent again much more time than initially allocated with us. It is usually wild. I think you prepared some slides. We didn't get to it, as you can see. It's always wild with Rory. It's always many topics: tax rebates, why we shouldn't talk to the finance people, and anything like so much we covered.
Yeah.
People in the chat asked whether there's recording. Yeah, for internal purposes, you can see the recordings. We recorded that wild ride. Rory, I thank you very much for making space. I think it's even your vacation right now at the moment.
Not quite, but no, don't worry, it'll be fine.
The Lord might bless you for all of that, and keep it doing. We follow your content all over the place, and recommend your books, and hopefully we find a German translator for it eventually.
Please, that'd be a joy. Yeah, German, Spanish, French, every other language, Korean. You can get in Japanese. You can get in Dutch. The Dutch will speak English anyway. You can get it in Finnish. You can get it, but you can't get it in French, German, Spanish.
Okay, we are on it. We are on
Thank you ever so much.
Thank you so much, Rory.
All the best.
Great. All the best.